Today I thought I would do a blog post about the Guernsey Fairies. I've previously done a blog post on the Jersey Fairies, but in some ways the Guernsey fairy lore is much richer and much more interconnected than the Jersey fairy lore, which is a little bit scrappy. So in Guernsey we've got loads and loads of fairy sites sort of dotted all around the landscape. So we've got Le Creux up by Lerry, and there's lots of fairy lore associated with this site. So the idea that if you left if you wanted your knitting done, if you left your knitting, your needles, your wool and everything outside this site, and you put a bowl of milk porridge there, you left it overnight, and you come back the next morning, and the fairies will have knitted you a socks or a jumper or whatever you wanted. So that's a nice little bit of fairy lore. We also have in Guernsey, up on the Plenmore headland, something called a table de pion, and this was originally a sort of stopping and resting place for a procession that used to go around the island called Chauvenchy, where I think they used to, it was an ancient highway inspection, and this table was used as a stopping off point, but because it's a ring, there was some fairy lore that became associated with it, and it sort of, the fairies were believed to go and dance on top of this table, but now it's sort of used as a sort of fabled picnic site. It's really pretty, so that's quite a cute little story. There's also supposedly a network of caves under St Saviour's Church that were built by the fairies, and these caves and tunnels were dug by the fairies and pop up at various ancient cromlechs and sites around the island. So one of these caves comes up at Le Creux at Lerry, another one comes up at Le Creux Mailly at Torteville, and another one comes up at Saints Bay. So Guernsey has quite a rich fairy lore and quite a rich fairy geography. There's also loads of really, really interesting and fun stories connected to some of these sites in Guernsey. One of my favourite is Gibbet de Fée, which literally stands for the fairies' gibbet. This is a rather gruesome story. So the fairies used to have control of L'Encresse Common, but the witches and their evil magic came along, and the fairies started getting really upset with the witches, and they were really sad, and they wanted to drown their sorrows. So there was something called La Fontaine de Fée, which was supposedly to make you forget your sorrows, this magical fountain. But unfortunately, because the fairies themselves were magic, the spring's power would not work on them. So the fairies then decided to morbidly troop back to this ancient stone called Gibbet de Fée, sort of a little bit like Stonehenge. It's now being destroyed, and the fairies supposedly hung themselves with blades of grass on this ancient monument. There's quite a similar story in Jersey that happened up on the coast at Noirmont, where a little man was said to be seen hanging himself off a cabbage stalk. This little man was thought to be one of the fairies. So this theme of fairies hanging themselves seems to be in both islands. It also ties into a wider theme of fairies constantly being part of a disappearing and vanishing and fading away race. But of course this is sort of a more finite version thereof. There's also another tale about a Mr. Hocart who destroyed one of the cromlechs, one called La Roque-qui-Sonne at L'Encresse Common also. So Mr. Hocart decided he'd smash up this ancient monument to build his house. Now, various accounts have various misfortunes that befell him. Usually his house burns down in the versions, then he might try and build another house and this burns down. There's also one version where the stones from Roque-qui-Sonne get sent away in a ship to England, and the ship sinks on the way, killing all the crew. Mr. Hocart was apparently then moved to Alderney, but eventually died when a ship's rigging fell on his head. It's thought that if you disturbed these ancient sites and gained the wrath of the fairies, you would know about it. And this is obviously something that befell Mr. Hocart. In some ways it was good, this fairy law, because it protected a lot of ancient monuments. But we've also seen that a lot of the monuments in Guernsey have disappeared, so Gibet de Fay isn't there anymore. So whether this piece of fairy law was taken that seriously or not, debatable. When talking about the Guernsey Fairies, we can't avoid the story of the Guernsey Fairy invasion. So the story runs that a young girl was out fishing on the shoreline, and she saw a little swarm of green men emerging from Creux Fair. These men were armed with longbows, and they made demands that all the Guernsey maidens would marry them. Now, of course, the mortal Guernsey men weren't really very happy about this, so they decided to have a battle with the fairies. Now, the fairies, being supernatural creatures, obviously beat the men. There were two lucky survivors. The survivors hid in a oven at St Andrews, but they were the only two men that survived the battle with the fairies. The road in St Peter Port, La Rouge Rue, is said to take its name from the blood of the men of Guernsey running down the road after they were slaughtered by the fairies. After all the men of Guernsey had been got rid of, the fairies settled down with the mortal women in peace and set about repopulating the island and cultivating the lands and stuff. As with fairies, they inevitably got called back to the invisible realm, and they left Guernsey, and it is said that all Guernsey people, apart from the descendants of the true people in the oven of St Andrews, are descendants from the fairies, and hence why Guernsey people are said to be slightly short and stocky. There's various sort of conjecture of how this story came about. Obviously, Guernsey being an island and a coast, in the days where there was constant risk of invasion, I think that the fairy lore says something about the fear of invasion there was in the population. Being on an island, you're very, very vulnerable to coastal invasion. McCulloch thinks that it's actually a historical change of a story of the invasion of Yvonne de Gaulle in the 14th century, where his Spanish troops are converted into the denizens of fairyland. I think McCulloch's trying to rationalise the story here and trying to pin it to a certain historical invasion, but it does tell us something about the fear that the Guernsey people had about invasion. Another sort of spin-off of this Guernsey fairy invasion story is the story of the girl who falls in love with a fairy and is taken away to the mainland. This girl in different versions has a different name. So in Lane Clark's version she's called Lizzie Bayeux, whereas in McCulloch's version she's called Michelle Sagari. The basic premise of the story is that a beautiful young girl who's fairly dreamy and into fairies herself meets a beautiful young man on the shoreline, and he's generally asleep. Anyhow, this man generally woos her on the shoreline, shows her the wonders of fairyland, and she agrees to go off and be his wife. This fairy king generally comes from England, and the young girl sails off in his fairy boat with him and goes to be his bride. Now, people miss her, and the idea of the Guernsey lily, the Nerine sarniensis, it's a kind of beautiful red amaryllis, was said to be a memory of this maiden who was taken away to fairyland, and the idea was that the fairy gave her a bulb and she planted it, and this was a memory of her to her family. This is also quite an interesting story because I think it relates quite a lot to islanders and dating patterns with islanders. You can imagine a girl from the Guernsey would go and marry an Englishman. So it's quite a similar story to what might happen in real life. There's also another story about the Guernsey lily, that it was actually not brought by the fairies at all, and it was actually run overground by a wrecked Dutch ship. and the bulbs sort of floated over to the coast and started growing in Guernsey. So that's a more rational version of the Guernsey story.